one of the other things to understand about the network are something we call terminators. Terminator resistors are what's used at the ideally the furthest ends of the network, or longest cables. And the terminator is necessary in the network for this reason. I'll use a little example here. If we were in a big stadium and a bunch of us were talking and there was nothing in there, just an empty stadium, you're going to have a lot of echoing and a lot of reverberation. It's going to be hard for you to understand what I'm saying because of all the echoing and noise going on around. Because of the reflection of the sound waves off, because there's no furniture in there, there's no flags hanging or anything like that. So you've got a lot of echoing of the sound waves, if you will. Well, that's kind of the same thing that's happening in the network when you don't have terminators. The messages on the network are being sent back and forth at 250,000 messages a second. Okay, so it's very, very fast. So with that many messages flying around, what actually happens when a message comes to the end of the longest point electrically, it hits the dead end essentially of that conductor and actually reflects back or almost is like an echo. I know it's kind of hard to understand because we don't think of it in those terms when we're talking about electrical things, but that's actually sort of what's happening there, is there's these reflections or echoes in the messages that are being transmitted. So this kind of makes it hard for the system to hear clearly when there's these reflections going on there. So what we do is put a terminator or a load, and that suppresses these echoes. That would be like, putting sound deadening material around the room. So now these echoes don't take place, and now I can hear much more clearly, okay? And that's essentially what terminators are doing. So in any network, there would be 2 terminators installed. Now, typically, like for example with Trimark in earlier years, you may remember there's like a terminator plug that you had to put into the harness, okay? And that was something they required you to put in the harness. Well, with the number of terminations and units that were running on the motorhome plant for every motorhome, it was becoming a challenge to remember to install those terminators, and if they're not installed, the system doesn't work properly. So what we're doing is building the terminators right into the product for Tiffin. So on the diagram here, you'll see which keypads have the terminators installed in them. So you can see right there in the diagram. The keypads that are part of the actual main non-slide out area are where we want to have the terminators. So each diagram in every one of our manuals will show you which switch panels are the terminator switch panels, okay? So in there, there's this little 120 ohm resistor that's soldered right onto the circuit board. So what you get then is this, essentially. This is a very simplified diagram here. You can see the G6 panel and these terminator resistors that are installed onto the keypads at either end of the network, or at the 2 longer ends of the network. Okay, so if you were to measure with a multimeter, the way that it's wired up here, the 2 120 ohm resistors hooked up like this in parallel will actually measure 60 ohms on your multimeter. Does that make sense? So that's the other thing to always check when you're dealing with a network issue, is what's my CAN high and low voltage and what's my termination resistance. Those are the 2 big things to remember if you're dealing with a network troubleshooting. So what you'll want to do when you're testing this resistance is you want to turn the power off of your, it's not going to hurt anything if you did it this way, but if you were to take a reading like this on a hot network that's running, you're going to see this reading jump around all over the place. It's going to be reading 70 ohms and down to 40 ohms, and it's just all over the place because of the way that a multimeter works when it sends out its own little signal to measure resistance. So what you want to do is just shut the house power off and just take that reading, could be back here or could be at a place where you can access the blue and the white wires, and just put your multimeter to ohms, and you should measure 60 ohms on there, okay? Okay, so the resistors are built into the keypads. So if I've only got 120 ohms there, the terminator resistor is fairly easy for you to identify. On the circuit board, if you pop the cover off, we actually have printed right on there, terminator, so you can see if the little resistor is soldered on there. If it's not, that would be the one issue. But there's another possibility that's much more common and much more likely. If I were to have no connection here, because maybe a bad termination on a wire or something like that, what I've got essentially is a break in this wire here, a break in this circuit or this loop. So now where I'm measuring with my multimeter, I'm really only measuring 1 resistor, not 2. Does that make sense? So at that point, you can kind of determine, you can check out, where that break is. You know which cables are your terminator cables. It's the 2 in the diagram here. that we looked at earlier. And so you can see here and here, we have the Terminator switch panel, so it's probably going to be the cables that are going to one of those two locations. Does that make sense? So then you can just focus on that. So what are the two things you want to check with network now? Voltage and ohms. Okay? So those are the two things that you can kind of check on there.